Tonight, we are pleased to have New York Times bestselling author Dave Cullen. Mr. Cullen has written for Vanity Fair, BuzzFeed, Politico, New Republic, Newsweek, New York Times, London Times, Washington Post, and has appeared on NBC Nightly News, PBS NewsHour, CBS Sunday Morning, Nightline, Anderson Cooper 360, Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes. It goes on and on and on. He's the author of the award-winning Columbine, and tonight he's here to discuss the subject of his new book, Parkland, The Birth of a Movement, which was just released near the anniversary of the shooting of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Please join me in welcoming Dave Cullen.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. I appreciate it, and this weather. And great to see the Moms Demand Action Group here. That's really wonderful. Appreciate what you're doing. So 20 years ago, obviously something really horrible happened at Columbine, which sort of set off this whole school shooter era, or mass shooter era, which we didn't really realize at the time. And I lived in Denver at the time, and I was out there in the first hour, driving out there originally thinking it would be nothing, but of course it was horrible. And I just stayed on the story, and there were two reasons. The second reason was understanding the killers and why they did it, why they would do something so horrible, because it just seemed unthinkable, bless you. But the first reason that really got me going, and the other half of the book, happened earlier, and it happened on the second day. Because the first day when I got to Columbine, it was kind of exactly what you would expect of a scene of a mass murder. There was pandemonium, people running everywhere, screaming, sobbing, moms and kids, and just clutching each other and holding for dear life when they would find each other. Extremely emotional, obviously. So I went back the next morning and expected a milder version of that, and I was more shocked by the second day because nobody was crying. Almost nobody, especially the boys. There were nearly 2,000 kids, nearly all of them went out to Clement Park surrounding the school, and no tears, just these blank looks. Blank affect is what psychiatrists call it. And they had all gone into the numb stage. And when I talked to trauma experts about that, this is common for anywhere 10 to 15% of a population like that might go into such a thing. Close to 100% is sort of unheard of, but this event was unheard of, where it wasn't just a horror, it was completely unexpected, completely took them by surprise. So I didn't expect or plan to do a book at first. I just knew I had to go keep coming back and find out what happened to those kids. And I didn't, I knew it would take a long time before we would know. I was really afraid there would be sort of like the worst of the Vietnam veterans era, and that these kids would be messed up for life. And I didn't know how or if they would get through it or who they would get through it. And so that's what I wrote about Columbine about, was those two things, the killers driving it and then what happened to those kids and how they got over it, and they did. So that took me 10 years, and I had 2 bouts of PTSD 7 years apart, secondary post-traumatic stress disorder, which I had no idea was a thing, but let me tell you, it's a thing. And the second round of it really was rough and scary, and then I agreed with my shrink to several rules, one of which was do nothing like I ended up doing. And when I finished 10 years ago with the book, I was so relieved and really happy to move on and never gonna, talk about this again once I did the book launch. And got to work on my book on 2 gay soldiers, which I had been sort of doing in the background while writing Columbine, and spent most of the last 10 years, so now almost 20 years on that project. And so that's what I would expect it to have been here talking about today, but I'm not. So a few things happened, and obviously, the universe has a really good sense of humor and likes, throwing these curves at us, especially when we say never. things. So even before the Columbine book, I was asked to speak about it frequently and about these mass shootings, although we still, 10 years out, had no idea what we were really in for. It hadn't really escalated yet. It sure has since then, where Columbine is no longer in the top 10. Yeah, that kind of tells you everything you need to know about what's going on since. So after the book, I became the mass murder guy. On all those shows she mentioned and many more, and writing for those different places, which is sort of the most the most horrible job in journalism. I mean, it's really a disgusting job, which I never would have chosen. You just sort of get sucked into it. And, I put an asterisk by journalism because I don't, it's sort of part of what I do is journalism, but that's kind of not the main thing. But it is a really awful job. And I kept saying that I have been cutting back and saying that I'm, going to put an end to it. And oddly enough, after Parkland, the morning after, I was on New Day and told Chris Cuomo that I think this is going to be the last one. I think I'm going to cut it off and not do this anymore. And again, laughter from the universe. About 5 minutes later, on the elevator down at CNN at the Time Warner Center, I saw an interview. David Hogg was on the same segment as me. And I saw him on the elevator on the right down, and I stayed on the elevator. And it's about 8 minutes long, and I could not believe my eyes or ears. And this just did not seem like a day one survivor. Like nothing like that. Like he had leapt 5 or 6 stages of grief and trauma. And that was stunning. I walked home from there. I live in Hell's Kitchen, just 10 minutes away. And I walked home thinking, that's really odd. And I turned on the TV to prepare for more of these shows. And there were more of them. I mean, nobody as eloquent or as powerful as him calling out adult America and, essentially saying, we're children and you're letting your kids die. But a lot of kids with a similar story. And I was like, what the hell? So by noon, I was writing a piece for Politico on, is this time different? And if so, why? And so, so that weekend, I decided to break all my rules of going back to a place like that, to the scene of a crime. And when my editor at Vanity Fair called, and he knows me, and he said, I know you're not allowed to go back to one of these places, but would you consider going back? And I was so taken by the kids already. And that was on Saturday, and I said, let me sleep on it. And Sunday, I said, okay. And meanwhile, that morning, while I was sort of figuring it out, the kids announced the March for Our Lives. And I was actually, one of the things that intrigued me was, or scared me, is whether they were going to pull this off, or how they were going to pull it off. Because 5 weeks seemed borderline reckless. Like, God, and a bunch of high school kids, what are they going to be able to pull off? I'm sure there will be a march in Washington, but, will it be sort of a big mess? Will they really get crowds there? Will it be, and in some ways a poor showing is worse than no showing at all. Because, the right will like nothing better than to say nobody cares. If 20,000 people came out, big deal. America doesn't care about this. So they really had to pull it off. And I kind of had my doubts about whether they could. And then I was really surprised. So Sunday afternoon, I got David Hogg's number, and he put me on the speakerphone, which would turn out they were in Cameron's living room. I had no idea where they were. And he kept it sort of vague. But talking to them all, and he said, I said I wanted to come down there right away, like tomorrow. And he said, well, it's too late to get on the bus with us to Tallahassee, but you can follow ahead, you can follow behind. And I was like, bus at Tallahassee? I thought you were going to D.C. They had announced it an hour ago on Meet the Press and all those shows. And he said, oh, yeah, we're doing that. We're doing this, instant thing right away. We're getting ready to go tomorrow to Tallahassee, or in 2 days. We're going to have a meeting tomorrow. And Jackie Korn, who I'd never heard of, said, hi, yeah, I'm sort of taking the lead on that, and explained a little. And I'm just thinking, wait a minute, you're doing another thing? Like, don't you kids think you need to focus? But like, okay, I'm like, oh God, I'm just afraid they're gonna blow it. Like, but like, okay, that's great. And you know, I said, well, you know, what are you doing to prepare for that? Or there's some meetings I can come to first, because I really want to sort of like get the behind the scenes. And she said, well, we're having an organizational meeting for the volunteers tomorrow, because they were going to get 100 kids to go to Tallahassee, and they had rented 3 buses. And she said, yeah, but the meeting tomorrow, you know, you're not going to want to go to that. It's just, and I'm like, oh, I think I probably do. And she said, no, it's really going to be boring stuff. I assure you, it's going to be like permission slips and what to wear and to bring sleeping bags and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, no, I definitely want to go to the meeting. Because, you know, I have no interest in doing the, you know, parachute journalism or the, you know, photo walk stuff. I don't want to be there in front of the Capitol and be like, okay, here's some kids that are meeting with the governor or, you know, state representatives or whatever. And what's that like, kids? I want to know what it took to make that happen. Are the moms freaking out? Are they showing up? Are they agreeing to, you know, sign the permission slips? Do they have angry questions? Are they afraid, like, you know, my son or daughter just came from a funeral? You know, what are you planning here? So I want to know all those things, and how does it happen? And really, like over the weekend, you plan this? Like, how is this going to come off? So that was really interesting, and it came off fantastic. And the governor sort of was shamed. When I got there, the governor still hadn't agreed to meet with them, but he was kind of shamed into it and agreed to that night. And then agreed to some concessions, which really pissed off the NRA. I mean, they were modest, but it was the dam finally breaking of somebody, you know, calling the NRA's bluff, one of their own people. So I agreed with my editor, and here I still had no intention of writing a book. In fact, I was 3 years late on my contract of my Gay Soldiers book. So I agreed with my Vanity Fair editor. I was going to cover it for 5 weeks, 3 to 5 pieces for the website, and help produce a video they were doing. And that was it. Not a minute more, and I was just not going to tell my editor at HarperCollins that I was just, you know, playing hooky, and hopefully she wouldn't see any of the stories. Or if she did, then, you know, okay, it'd be too late, and I'll be back on it soon. But I can tell you the day that I first had I won't say that I decided to do the book, but I really had the first moment where, like, oh, I think this might need to be a book. And well, let me backtrack. Well, and that was 29 days out. That was on March 15th, approximately 4 in the afternoon. And something that happened a little before then, 2 weeks earlier, was during the Oscar weekend, just like now. How many people saw the Dana Loesch video they put out last night that the NRA put out? About the Oscars and just liberals, and it's sort of like, I was going to say Leni Riefenstahl light, but it's actually she's putting Leni Riefenstahl to shame. It is really scary stuff. So you saw it, so hardly anybody else. Good. Actually, what's the name of your fearless leader? Shannon Watts, actually. I saw it because she retweeted it, dissing her. But so if you go to Shannon's Twitter feed, you'll find it. And but it's really horrific. But last year they kind of had a similar one where Dana Loesch sort of made fun of the Time's Up movement with the hourglass. Did any of you see that one? And within 24 hours, the Parkland kids had a kind of a satire meme sort of making fun of that and doing it back and throwing it back at her, and got more than 1 million hits. And it was their most successful meme right off, and that seemed kind of spectacular. So then 2 weeks later, on March 15th, I was down there, my second trip to Parkland, and interviewing Jackie Corin, their kind of master implementer at Starbucks. And I got to know Jackie pretty well by then, and I was kind of interested in seeing The Office, because several of the kids, when I've been talking to them, had made a mistake, and instead of saying, well, I was noticing instead of saying, oh, I just came from Cam's house, or we got to go over to Cam's house later, it started being The Office, The Office, The Office. And, you know, one of the sort of journalistic tactics that I do is generally when I hear something that pings my ear that's different or surprising, I don't usually let on the first time, because you never want to sort of scare off a tourist. And the last thing you want to go is like, wait a minute, there's an office? And then they're just like, oh, you know, like, you don't sort of like, you just keep giving them rope. So the first couple times I didn't say anything, and then I started asking like, oh, so you have an office now? And they'd be, don't tell anybody I mentioned the office. Like, okay. And they kept mentioning the office. So then at one point I asked Alfonso, who's one of the wonderful kids, I asked him if I could visit. He said, no, we're not allowing any press there. And I said, how about if you just take some pictures inside that I won't publish, but just so I can describe it? That'll really give me a sense of how you're organizing this. Like, do you guys have maps on the wall with pins for the sibling marches? Or, you know, are there to-do lists? Or just, you can see a lot about how people are organizing by what the place looks like. And he said he would do that, but then he forgot. So then I was having coffee with Jackie at Starbucks after school, right near the school, and I told her that, and she said, oh yeah, of course he forgot. But she said she would take some pictures. And I'm like, great. And she's like hyper organized, and I knew she would. And then I decided to just kind of throw the Hail Mary pass, and I said, any chance that I could, go in there? And she said, I really don't think so. It would really be Cameron's call. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, so Cameron's kind of in charge. Even though they all, bless you, everything was a democracy, and they were talking about, it's all groups consensus. But I kept hearing Cameron's name a lot of these things of like, oh, I'll check with Cameron. So I'm thinking, okay, more and more Cameron sort of first among equals. And then like 40 minutes later, kids and texting, I hadn't even seen that she had texted anyone. Plus, I didn't know that there was this whole group text they had going on that was just massive, where they'd been discussing me for like weeks. And every time I was talking to one of them, they were like, and about all the reporters. And like this whole thing was going on behind the scenes that I had no idea. I don't think any of my peers did. And then about like 40 minutes later, she's just like in the middle of a question. She's like, okay, you can go. And I'm like, what? And she's like, you can go to the office. They said it was okay, except David said, as long as you don't stay too long. And I was like, okay. And then I'm thinking like, oh, okay, so like David's also maybe kind of calling some shots or whatever, or like he sticks his nose in there. And like that wasn't really that surprising. I'd gotten to know David pretty well. So I'm like, okay, great. And, often, like once you get in someplace, you can kind of stay. But I try not to do that because when I agree to something, I try to stick to it because, then they know the next time, and I try to honor those things. So when we got in there, it was really kind of interesting. So it was very secret because they'd had all these death threats, and they weren't telling anyone where it was, or for the most part, that it existed. So I followed Jackie in her car, and we got to this nondescript, a strip mall in Coral Springs, I think it's called, one town over. And then we walked back to the back of this strip mall, and she pointed out on the window on the way in, it was still stenciled, licensed practical nurse and the name of the person. And she said, that's the previous tenant. We just left that as a misdirect. And then, she rapped like whatever the number of times, and that was like jokes back and forth, which is just, they were always joking. And then we went in, and she gave me a quick tour. But one of the first things I noticed was this big redhead guy that I'd never seen before. Actually, a couple of people I'd never seen before. And the redhead guy seemed to be kind of in charge. Like, not completely, but everyone was kind of deferring to him. And I'm like, okay, who is this? And then there was this, short, kind of scrawny, black-haired kid. I'm like, who are these people? That's on my list of things to find out. But meanwhile, Jackie takes me on a little tour around it. Here's like the room with a board table. Here's the storage room that we don't use. There's the bathroom. I'm like, I got to check out your bathroom. I could not believe it was because that's how you find out about it. It was spotless. I even said it out loud. I'm like, I can't believe how spotless your bathroom is. And she's like, oh, we tried to treat it like a public bathroom. And I'm like, well, exactly. Like, have you been to the gas station? This is not like a public bathroom. But, and in the fridge, like, it was completely stocked, mostly with juices and stuff. Yeah, but she also, like, when she was going around, like, this is blah, 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 this is the writer's room. And I'm thinking, the writer's room? But I didn't say anything. And then, we wrapped up, and I tried to keep it to about 5 minutes. But I introduced myself to this guy who turned out to be Matt Deitch. And I'm like, oh, I met your brother Ryan yesterday. But I'm thinking, like, I thought Ryan was a senior. and you definitely look older. And he's like, yeah, I graduated like a year and a half ago. There's a few of us who are recent graduates who were good friends with them, and I was a good friend of Cam's, and so we're in on it too. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And now he's like one of the key players. He's one of the major players. He always was kind of from the beginning. There were 5 or 6 of these people that they were pretty much keeping under wraps for a while. And Dylan, the black-haired guy, was one of them too, because they were taking all this flack that, who's pulling the strings? Is it the DNC? Is it the Obama people? Is it the Hillary people? Who's really doing this? And they were really doing it themselves. But because of that, they didn't want to, muddy the message by saying, well, it's not completely high school kids. There's, a handful of us, our friends who just recently graduated from the school too, which, fair enough. And they had a little more distance and a little wisdom, but they didn't even want to, muddy the message with that. After months later, by summer, Matt was on The Daily Show with Emma, and he's very much out in front now. But at the beginning, they were being a little cautious about it. So anyway, and I want to get onto the question soon, but I'll wrap some of this up. I just love telling stories. I was supposed to keep these shorter. But but they're also the wonderful. All these kids just sort of amazed me. So I asked Matt what was going on, and he said, oh, he was like the community outreach director, which was true, but he was really kind of the strategic planner of the group. And when I would meet him a month later, he told me that was his title now. And which is one of the amazing things about the kids is like, one of the main reasons for their success is they all found their niches and their calling and what they were good at and just kind of did it. And they kind of were good at different things. I'm getting a little off track, but like David Hogg, like 2 days earlier, and this is about 10 days before the march in DC, I had spent an hour in David's kitchen with him and was really wanting to know about the logistics of the march and how they were doing this, and I had all these logistical questions, and David didn't know the answer to any of that. And after about the 4th or 5th one, he was just like, look, I don't know this stuff. And he said, I view myself sort of like the press secretary. I'm just out there every day talking about this stuff. I'm like the Sarah Huckabee Sanders of this, except that I don't lie every day. And I was like, okay. And then when I talked to Jackie a couple days, she did know the answers to these things. And I told her, oh, good, because I was asking David. And she just started cracking up, like, you were asking David? Like, yeah, he doesn't. That's not what he does. But so each people, and when I asked Matt, actually when I asked Matt some of those, he's like, I don't know, like I'm, strategic planning and figuring out, I came up with a list of demands. And I'm like the guy who like, to get the demands, I did lots of research on different gun control, different things that had done in different countries, what worked, what didn't work in America, and I, curated a list of about 10 different articles, routed them around the group as the leading list so they could group, and then like moderated the discussion, and then, we agreed on them, and then I wrote the demands, and I'm doing that, and I'm out, flying to Berkeley. He had just gotten back, and these different places, and like I don't know logistics either. And the more I got to know them, like they each did their thing that they were really good at, and they weren't stepping in each other's things. It's like, that's partly why they really worked really wonderfully well. So then I want to talk to Matt. I'm like, can I interview you? I'm leaving town tomorrow. And he said, yeah, how about right now? I'm like, oh, I promised David I wouldn't stay too long. And he was like, David's not here anymore. And I was like, I know, but like, and then he gave me the whole thing of like, look, I'm doing like 16-hour days. If you really want to make me drive off-site, it will really be better. Like, trust me, I can kind of overrule David. Or on this, so I can do this if I want. He's like, it'll be better. I'm like, okay. So we went back, and he's like, let's go back to the writer's room. And I'm like, okay, the writer's room? And he just looks at me, and he's like, what, do you think this stuff is writing itself? And I was like, oh, and that's the moment. That's actually the first moment I started to see this as a book. Because there had been so many things, but that's when it crystallized. And then I came back after having lots of conversations with him, and then found out that like Dylan was like, I called them the memes man, and I threw out the story I was writing for Vanity Fair, and I called my editor from the parking lot. You're not going to believe what these guys are doing. It's like the Saturday Night Live writer's room in here, of these guys spitballing different ideas. And that's why 2 weeks earlier, when Dana Loesch had that NRA video that they, put out Oscar night, within 24 hours, these kids had this amazing thing that got, 1.5 million hits or whatever it was. It wasn't just because Sarah Chadwick didn't like hold up her phone and like do off the top of her head, something in response. Dylan wrote a script and spent the night and then came in and got feedback, and they went back and forth on the script. They rewrote the script, and they brought in the equipment. Emma held the boom. They had all these production values. They picked Sarah Chadwick because her personality kind of fit it the best. Like, they're creating their whole thing. That's why they're really good at this. That's why they're succeeding. And I was like, wow. And every time I went back there, I felt similar things. I'm like, there is so much behind the scenes of the story that is making these kids work. It's, it feels sometimes like a magic show. Like now looking back is the March for Our Lives, even my doubts, it is now in the 3rd or 4th place as the 3rd or 4th largest single-day protest in American history. And the other event that they're in the virtual tie with is the largest event of the entire Vietnam era, which was 10 years of the making. I think it was the one in 1973, the biggest one of that entire era, which was by far the largest in American history. It took 10 years, people in their 20s, this 5 weeks, high school kids. And the largest of the Vietnam era was only topped and dwarfed finally by the Women's March at the start of the Trump presidency. And then again, the number 2 is the second Women's March. And then in close, and the reason they're close is like nobody has exact numbers on any of these, but they're very good organizations have done a lot of precise crowd counting, so we have pretty good estimates. So they've done these amazing things, and we've seen them all along, but like it's not just happening. The reason is because these kind of amazing kids are doing this behind the scenes. The other thing that really struck me that same day too is Matt had this interesting dog tag around his neck that I said, that's kind of interesting. And it was like a red dog tag, and it just had a peace symbol and the words principle number 6. I'm like, what's that about? What's principle number 6? And he said, oh, I got 6 of these in different colors. They're Martin Luther King's 6 principles of nonviolence. And we got these from these kids called the Peace Warriors from Chicago 2 weeks ago at Emma's house. I was like, what? So there's this whole amazing backstory. I've got a chapter called Peace Warriors where 2 weeks after Parkland happened, almost from day one, the Parkland kids have decided we are not going to try to solve this problem of attractive, affluent white kids from the suburbs getting attacked in their schools, which is what school shootings usually are. And America quakes like, oh my God, more suburban kids, unsafe and killed. Meanwhile, they're dwarfed by the number of black and brown kids, primarily in the cities, in Chicago and Baltimore, Compton, DC, most of the big cities in America, who are dying in much bigger numbers, and we're kind of shrugging, not really noticing. So not only day one they decided they wanted to look at the bigger picture and address that bigger picture, it was really before. They had watched all these other shootings and had already been kind of appalled and kind of the inherent racism that we care more about the white suburban affluent kids, and kind of already knew that if this ever happened to them, they wanted to go much wider and address the much wider problem. And then they did. So, in those first days in Cameron's living room, they were mapping that out, and they didn't really know how to go about that. Because Parkland is a very affluent community. They are, fairly wealthy, rich, suburban, white and Latino kids. And there are a lot of African Americans, but they weren't on their team, primarily because these were Cameron's friends. And they, just weren't in the drama club and weren't his group of friends. So they didn't want to be the white saviors. They wanted to partner, and they weren't sure how to go about that. But actually, Arnie Duncan facilitated something about 2 weeks out, got in touch with Father Flager. Does anybody here know Father Flager in Chicago? No, okay, I was just in Chicago. Okay, you do, okay. Everybody in Chicago knows who he is. He's sort of like the white Al Sharpton of Chicago. If Al Sharpton in the same community, in the African community, was a white guy, but he's the pastor of the largest Catholic archdiocesan and African community church and community. And he's just like been working it for like decades with this community and kind of, beloved by his community in doing it. But so Arne Duncan, who was Obama's education secretary, also from Chicago, called him and said, we need to hook some of these kids up with the Parkland kids. Like, who should that be? Like, who are the best and brightest activists in Chicago? I'm sure there's some kids doing amazing things in their own schools about gun violence, probably with no money, no support, and yet they're making it happen. And he's like, I got the kids for you. There's a group in my school called Brave, and there's a group called the Peace Warriors in North Lawndale, which is on the west side of Chicago, which, by the way, it's not just the south side of Chicago. That's horrible. Big parts of the west side are too. These kids, the Peace Warriors, have done an amazing program. So they started to get this together on a Friday evening and called down to the Parkland kids and said, would you want to do this? Would you want to meet with these kids? The Parkland kids said, yes, we are so dying to meet them. Is there any chance they can come tomorrow? Because this is a Friday evening, and they're all in high school, right? They can only do this on weekends. They're all in school on both sides. And so they didn't want to wait a third week. They're like, can you do it tomorrow? And I said, we'll check. D'Angelo McDade said he got the call at about 11:50. He texted his friend Alex like at 11:51, 11:52, and they were like, we've got to go to Parkland tomorrow to meet them. It was all arranged overnight. The church footed the bill and flew close to 10 kids and a couple parents down to Parkland the next day, and they met at Evan Gonzalez's house and spent the day. And that's when they it was during a break, because they took a lot of breaks, because all the kids were sharing their different stories of how they had been shot at. And the Chicago kids mostly, a lot of their relatives had either been killed or shot at, and that was just like a living daily thing. So it was a pretty intense thing. They all told me it just kept bringing them right down as everybody would tell their story. So they took a lot of breaks. They swam in Emma's pool. And during one of the breaks, Emma was off to the side talking to D'Angelo, who's executive director of the Peace Warriors, which in theory should be a paid adult position, but it's a high school kid, because they have no money. So he was talking to Emma, and she was talking about how, so this is 2 weeks out, how this stuff had been really tough, but the activism had also been kind of healing, oddly enough. And he thought, okay, actually maybe this is the moment. He'd been waiting for the right moment, and he pulled out of his pocket, I believe, the blue dog tag. And God, I think it is principle number 2. Is it 3? That it's 2 or 3. That, I forget the exact wording, but that injustice can also be healing or fighting it. God, I should know this one by now. I have I think I have a brain block of paraphrasing him. And she was like, and he started telling her about the 6 principles, and she's like, wait a minute, wow, this is great. Can we do this with the whole group? So I said, yeah. And then they talked about the 6 principles and had dog tags for all the kids. And the reason in particular that this was really kind of perfect is because the kids had already been kind of trying to figure out their own rules and how to police themselves. They already had the sense. They'd already decided early on that, who remembers Marco Rubio being sort of humiliated by Cameron Kasky during that first CNN town hall? Okay, quite a few people. He regrets that now. And he regrets that, he said, like, he went there with the purpose of humiliating Rubio. And realized then it's like, Rubio isn't the enemy. He shouldn't, he's a person too. So they were trying to, clean up their act a little, but trying to decide, well, what are the boundaries? How should we be behaving on a lot of different things? And then the Peace Warriors showed them the 6 principles, and they were like, this is kind of exactly what we were looking for and trying to figure out ourselves. Like, somebody's already invented this, this wheel. And not only did MLK do it, he went to India to meet with Gandhi, to learn from what he had done with the British Empire. And we're talking about, like, and Gandhi, had done his research. We're talking about hundreds of years of people honing these ideas. And they said, this is what we were fumbling for already. This is kind of beautiful. Like, somebody's already done this work. So, okay. So that really helped them, and I think it really also captured something that they already kind of were feeling, that they were part of something longer, a whole much larger process. And I think, especially uniting with the Peace Warriors, and they've been working together ever since, that this is not just a recent thing, that they are part of that same legacy of the civil rights movement, which has not ended, and which has different problems right now, with people of color still being killed in horrible numbers in the cities. And that's a big part of what the problem is right now. And they've fused their movement with the existing movement of gun violence, and working very closely with those groups. And D'Angelo and Alex were two of the kids who were invited to speak at the March for Our Lives in DC. And I don't know if you remember, those are the two kids who came out with neon duct tape over their mouths. They came out on stage together with the duct tape, I forget which was which, orange and green, and they tore the duct tape off and then gave their speech. And their message was very powerful. It's like, this is what we have to say. We have been saying this for years now, and you have not heard us. It's as if we've been muzzled. To white America, to most of America, we had no voice. And now we do, and we have something to say. But we've been saying it all along. And that's what a lot of the movement has been going on. And when I met those kids and discovered how much the Parkland kids were working with them, and then during the summer, they actually brought those kids on the bus. And the idea, so they did a 2-month bus tour across America, basically their entire summer vacation. And the idea was to bring 3 or 4 of those kids. They started in Chicago, and bring 3 or 4 of those kids with them for a couple days of the first week. In Chicago, the kids were all so excited. So many wanted to do it. They brought about a dozen on the bus, and then they stayed there. And it was so successful. Then after about a week or two, several of them rolled off. But every few cities, they were kept being on the lookout for other great activists in cities all across America. Whenever they met somebody who was like really dynamite, they invited them on the bus. And like that evening, got their parents to sign off on the permission slip and got on the bus. And some of them stayed for weeks at a time. 2 of the kids, Alex and one other woman whose name is escaping me, spent the entire month, or the entire summer on the bus. But most of them came on and off. And so, whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, people of all different geographies from around the country, as soon as they found an activist who had a voice, who was powerful, effective in their community, join us. And now those kids are part of the board. They are, at the end of the summer, at the end of the tour, is the first time the March for Our Lives kids decided to expand beyond their own high school and made these people from across America full partners in the group and expanded it to be a nationwide. And now their big thing now is building chapters all across America. So as I was learning this, by the way, so obviously by this time it's way more than the 5 weeks. I had agreed in the first month, okay, Vanity Fair wanted me to do a full piece for the print magazine. It'd take a couple months to do it. I agreed to that. And then during that process, I'm like, I had no idea what was going on here. And frankly, sadly, I never saw most of this reported. I mean, most of our media is just, about an inch deep, and it's sort of the same stories all along, and it's like, here's David Hogg, a profile on him, here's Emma. After the first month or so, most of the stories about them were profile pieces, and usually on those same 2 people. And so what I decided when I did the book, when I was mapping out the book, is I definitely want something on Emma and David. They're in there, David in particular. But it's much more about the people you don't know who are really making powerful impact. Alfonso, Jackie Korn, is really kind of the star of the young woman who's an implementer. She's a junior. She's just kind of amazing. The Peace Warriors are major characters. Tio Manny, who's, you might have seen him. He almost got thrown out of the congressional hearings a couple of weeks ago for talking back to that. And he does these murals. His son, Joaquin, who was one of the 17 killed, he's kind of amazing. And he has this incredible bond with the kids. They call him Tio Manny, which means Uncle Manny. He had me call him that and call him that in the book. So these, the memes man, Matt. So that's what I really wanted to write about and to show you behind the scenes what it really took in the birth of this movement the first year, and right up through the midterms where, I won't go into the details, but they really changed the dynamic and had a huge impact. Okay, so that's probably longer than I had planned to spend, so let's bring the other
panel.
people in here and hear what they have to say.
Great.
So thank you. What did I do on time?
Okay, we have Edward Zhang, who is president, and he's representing all the students here, representing the president of the Horace Greeley High School Political Awareness Committee
Very
Club.
nice.
He's representing all the students at Horace Greeley High School.
Wonderful.
No pressure, Edward. No pressure.
None at all. None at all.
Sheila Berson, who is a board member of the Newcastle League of Women Voters and the State League of Women Voters. And Reverend Tenku Ruff from the Chappaqua Interfaith Council.
Thanks. Let's hear for those three.
Edward, do you want to start the questions?
Yeah, sure. So, nice to meet you, of course.
Thanks.
But the book was amazing, by the way. I recommend everyone in the stage actually take a look at the book.
Here, I get my wallet back there. I'll give you the $20 later.
There'll be copies for sale at the end, just so you know.
The details are incredible. But to start off, I guess the first question I would like to ask is, from your knowledge of the Parkland students and from watching them, what do you think? How do you think they could have approached it better? Maybe did they make any mistakes?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, they made a lot of mistakes. I have a chapter called Setbacks. And actually, that's one of the things that I want to get across to young activists, too. Well, let me one quick thing is like, when I probably talked to way more activists than those kids, kind of everywhere they went. I tried to talk to people whenever possible, before, during, and after. And I heard two things typically. Well, kind of three. One is, I want to do something like this. But then kind of two things is, one, I have no idea how. And number two, I'm definitely paraphrasing, but like, I don't think I can. Like, they didn't have the confidence to. And in terms of that confidence, I think the best thing for the confidence, well, when they would meet the kids, that would really inspire them. But I think the most important thing is they need to see where these kids failed. Because, they would talk to me about how, like, oh, I organized this thing and only 3 people showed up, or my faculty advisor doesn't want to, whatever. Every time that happens, they need to know that, Emma Gonzalez failed too. And Cameron Caskey had bad days. He ended up suffering from depression. And that it didn't always work. But I think the single biggest thing is the diversity issue, where they thought they had that pretty well in hand right off. They, brought friends and whoever came together, and then they had a group and a solid nucleus, and then they wanted to stay tight. That was working really well, and they didn't want to expand it to like 30,000 kids because that's just unwieldy. They thought, they had a pretty good number. And they kind of felt like, well, we got a lot of girls, we got boys, we got gays, straights, and lesbians, we got several Latinos and some white kids. We don't have any African Americans that didn't, but we got a pretty broad mix. And then right away, then when they started working with the Peace Warriors and the other kids from Chicago, they felt like, okay, we really got that covered. But they really didn't think about the fact that, like, well, that isn't quite enough. I can't remember, I think the stats, what is it, 10% or more of the school population is African American? Now I can't remember the number. But a sizable minority, and those kids weren't represented. And they did have a different take on things. So they should have figured out early on, hey, this is a problem, we got to add some kids. It was about the march, just before the march, when David was doing some press, that he got some pushback from a couple of the African-American kids in the school. But to their credit, then, they did respond, and they did add them. Over the next couple of weeks, they talked to a lot of kids, and by June, they added several. But, it'd been better if they had done that sooner. If they'd done that, really early on. I think that's the single biggest thing. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to do shorter answers because I always talk forever, so I'll keep going so we can do some more. But I think that'd be the biggest thing.
Sheila.
Okay, here's another general question.
Sure.
The movement sparked by Parkland has grown and includes many other groups, and I'd like to know, how do you see this movement moving forward in the future, and whether the Parkland leaders, whoever they might be now, what's their vision for the future?
Yeah, well, there's so many different groups out there. There was already the Mothers Demand Action, there's Giffords, there's Everytown. Well, like, you guys are part of Everytown now, right? So that merged with whatever it was before the mayors for, so there's a lot of different groups out there. Giffords is still separate, right? Okay, so there are a lot of different groups. And I think part of the power is different groups are organizing different ways and then there's also a Students Demand Action. And so they're sort of bringing different constituencies together. I think that's very powerful. The kids themselves, their organization is March for Our Lives, and they have chapters across the country which really got going because of the sibling marches, because there were nearly 800 of them. I can never remember. That includes about 70 or 80 overseas. But that was over 700 sort of starter different things. Nearly all of those were started by kids, high school or college kids in different cities, most of them, first time they had ever organized something. So they immediately, which was quite a daunting undertaking. I mean, they had to get, permits and everything from the ground up organized. So they sort of like, without kind of knowing they were doing it, they got the ball rolling all across the country. Now, more than 100 of those now have what they consider pretty solid chapters, and then smaller groups. But the big push this semester is college campuses, which last in the fall it was really a race to the midterms, and they're doing a lot on high schools and just in general, young people organized to vote or register to vote. Right. But the idea now is like at college campuses, that's kind of a no-brainer because every college campus has 100 or 200 different existing organizations, some political, like there's Young Republicans, there's a Democratic group, there's, a global warming group, and so forth. And there are funding mechanisms on most campuses for these groups. There's, there's office spaces, all these different kinds of things. So that's kind of an easy thing to do to get on every major college campus. The goal is most of those by the fall. So that when Jackie and David go to Harvard in the fall, and they're still going to be active in this, but they can't be doing this as their full-time job, and much less a 60-hour-a-week job. They will have a lot of this in place. And some of the people like Matt are still doing it full-time. So the idea is this group will be an independent, separate group doing this too, and that really has kind of the power of their voice and of what they went through and what happened last year.
Reverend Tenku.
Yeah, in reading your book and in hearing you, it feels like you went to a foreign country and learned how it works and their governmental system, and it's a very effective foreign country. And I want to know what we can do, we meaning the people you see here, older people, white people, to encourage more of them, because I want a lot more of these kids. Like I don't want to see one group. I want to see millions of them.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing, I do so much work with high schools ever since Columbine. I get invited to a lot of high schools, and I do a lot of Skypes. And the thing that always throws me is, in a good way, is every session I'm bowled over by at least 2 or 3 different things where I go, huh. And, adults in the consulting world or in general, we have this term of like thinking outside the box, which is, because we're all, inside our little boxes and we have to think out there. And that's where really the magical thinking happens. For the most part, kids who are still in high school, they haven't built the box yet. Right. They're already outside of it. And particularly, we really saw this in this situation, whereas with after Newtown in particular, most of us, me included, had given up. And the refrain was, which I'm sure every person here has heard, or many of you like me have probably said, some version of, if dead 6-year-olds isn't going to get America to do this, whatever will. That was just sort of like, that was really the death knell of hope for this. And we just accepted that we're in this political stalemate, it's not going to work, and we don't have any way out of this box, we're just trapped in here. And the kids just said, what? Yes, we are. F you. And David called us out as like, you're letting your kids die. And I mean, the truth hurt. That was such a painful slap. And so, I mean, I think that's the single biggest thing. And maybe what you're talking about, the different planet, is they're not accepting the inevitable yet. And that, in general, that kids things is like, you tell them like, no, we can't do that. You can't. And they're like, why? And sometimes like I have 8 siblings, so I have so many nieces and nephews. And sometimes, they can really bug you with the like, why not, Uncle Davey? And then you're like, oh, and then you sort of like, well, why? Maybe. Who did tell me that? Why did I accept this? And so I think that's the biggest thing. And this group is what was great is that they are uniting all sorts of other young people. And I mean, I think there is a power. So much of politics or social change is momentum. And the momentum is totally on their side right now. And sort of the power of this movement, to me, it's gathering as many other young people up into their organization as possible is sort of the key to this in my mind.
So are you saying we should listen to them more, pay attention to them more?
Yeah, totally. I mean, young people in general, I don't completely buy into the concept of children. I mean, little children, of course, but in high school, one of the things I get asked about this, I've been asked by journalists during this is like, how did you get access to these kids? And there's a couple, the biggest thing I knew right away when I was like, the pack journalism, and I'm like, oh God, how am I gonna do this? And I knew right away, even while I was having those thoughts, is, I'm just gonna stay. Like just with Columbine, all these other journalists are going to be gone in a day or two or a week, and I'm going to stay, and then they'll talk to me. So that's a big part of it. But the other parts are just like, journalism 101 to me of developing sources is, number one, don't be a dick, which you'd be really surprised how many of you probably who have dealt with reporters wouldn't be surprised. Not that all my peers are, but we can be a little unruly, especially when we've got a thing to do and we're on deadline. But I think the other biggest thing is like, it never occurred to me to talk to them like children, or to treat them like children, or talk down to them, or dumb it down. I just, when I talk to Jackie or Daniel or, any of them, I just talk to them the same way I'm talking to you now, and it would never occur to me not to. And it might be partly because I don't have kids. I mean, probably because I'm gay, and so I didn't think I could, and now I'm too old. And, but I've been an uncle. I think the uncle mentality happens because. Oh my God, I might get myself in real trouble. But I think this is real. So I've noticed I have 6 sisters, and 5 of them have kids. And I've noticed as you have kids, and when you've got 2-year-olds, like you're constantly having to tell them no and treat them like some of that, rubs off. And I get to be the uncle, which is very much like the grandparent. We're like, I don't have to send the boundaries, and I could just sort of like enjoy them. I think that's made it easier for me also to be a reporter with kids because I've never had to be the bad guy or the disciplinarian. I get to be the uncle. And I think I sort of have an uncle relationship with the kids. Just like with T.O. Manny, they call him Uncle Manny. He's like, he also doesn't try to be like the dad with them. He's just the uncle, and I think maybe that helps. But I think all of us, and I've got 3 nieces and nephews that are 3 right now, and obviously, oh my God. Even I FaceTime Seamus all the time, and I've learned I need to just start setting boundaries on him because so I get, like, you just constantly have to just, like, bring them in. But I've never had to do that. And I think so that's a challenge as adults, as after we spent our whole lives reining them in, that then turning that off sometimes and listening to them and being like, oh, well,
Good, Edward.
sometimes you are. Yeah, so that's hard.
Yeah, so looking.
You probably have some experience with that, right?
Yeah. So looking around the room today, there are actually a good amount of teens here today. And from what I've seen at our high school and from what I've heard talking to different people, there is a lot of interest in this subject from young people. So my question is something along the lines of, what advice would you give to young people who are also pushing for change in this area and maybe in other areas of activism as well?
And by this area, do you mean gun control?
Yeah, gun control
Okay,
specifically.
yeah. Oh, wait, so I lost it. What advice would I give them?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would get involved. Yeah, God, I'm struggling not to say something really cheesy. Well, there was actually an interesting I thought a really good email from Jackie Corin about a week or two ago as part of this organizing to their mailing list, which said, if you want to get active and you don't know how, here are two options. Number one, if you go to the March for Our Lives website, you can plug in, I guess, your zip code, and they will give you lists of lots of different groups in your area. And some are high school based, some are community based. There's a lot of overlap. So there's, you may well have 2 or 3 or 5 different, options. Join whichever one appeals to you. And if there isn't one, or you don't like any of those options, then start your own. And so that's option number 2, is starting your own. And if you want to do that, then also there's like a little, simple online form to fill out. And now March for Our Lives has regional coordinators. So a regional coordinator will get in touch with you and talk to you about how to do that and whether that's realistic and so forth. So you have either option. It's like join or start. And some people are joiners and some people are organizers. And a lot of it, I guess actually that would be my biggest advice is, know your personality, know who you are. If you're really like, why to be in charge of doing something, like, well, maybe you should start your own. But most people, that's a lot to take on and want to join one. So figure out which one you are and, and size up the groups in your area and, either join one or start one.
Sheila.
Interesting. Okay. I have another question.
Sure, please.
Why do you think the Parkland shooting inspired such a kind of a rapid and effective response nationwide as compared to other similar incidents that have happened in the past?
Yeah, that's the question. So I think it's just a perfect storm of different things. It is so many things aligned. But I will give you the top 3 in my mind is immediacy,
Right.
timing, which I mean in a slightly different sense, and then the messenger. And so by immediacy, obviously, like day one, they went right to it. And I think we all figured out the big mistake after, I think everybody agreed after Newtown was the big mistake, we waited too long. And Obama, they really decided to get their ducks in a row and have, figure out what legislation they wanted. He introduced it in the State of the Union address, which seemed great, but it was about a month out.
Right.
And, the conventional wisdom was that outrage had subsided. I think that's only half of it. In fact, the lesser half. Because then thinking this past year is because then everybody thought okay, the Parkland kids have a month. That's the window to accomplish something. Which is and they were like, we can't accomplish something in a month. First of all, to change the legislation, we need to change the legislators. And as far as we're aware, there's not any election happening in the next month. So that's silly. And that's such a punditocracy kind of view that makes no sense. So they had a much longer view. But then I wondered, well, what are they going to do after it fades? But it hasn't faded because I think it's not just the outrage that fades in a month, it's hope. Hope fades and hope dies. And after a month goes, the outrage starts to subside and we haven't done anything and it's clear we're not going to, and hope goes to hell and it's dead. And hope is a powerful thing. What did Emily Dickinson say? Hope is the thing with feathers. It's self-sustaining. As long as you keep winning or succeeding in some ways as you're taking powerful steps, hope can go on continuously. Look, all of us, our careers, our entire lives are built on hope and keep, making. But people who get beaten down and keep failing, you can get in that right in the hole. You either keeps going or it dies. So what we didn't realize, there was really a window a month to get the ball rolling in a big, powerful way. And then it can and would be self-sustaining. They didn't wait the month. They did it from day one.
Right.
It was under 24 hours that it was really going with David Hogg. So that was one huge thing. Timing in a different sense, a couple things, but I'll pick one of them. John De La Volpe, who is the head of polling for Harvard, is really kind of a brilliant guy on this, and I got a really short chapter called Harvard, where they went to Harvard. Well, that's another thing, by the way, they went to Harvard. And not only, so Harvard already had this, I think, 2 or 3 day seminar about polling in young people, which sounded perfect. The problem was timing. It was scheduled for the week right before the March for Our Lives, Monday and Tuesday, and before the weekends. Obviously, the very last week, ramping up to this monumental thing that they were going to, do in 5 weeks. They went anyway. they went like, this is like a perfect opportunity. This is like made for us, what we're trying to do. They've all, the best, sorry if there's any, Princeton people here or whatever, but, at Harvard, these brilliant people who are studying our demographic who are having teachers, they went and they learned. So, they're little sponges, so that's another thing. But anyway, what John Della Volpe talks about is the fuse was already lit. This happened in an environment where there was something literally called the resistance.
Right.
Which was kind of perfect in two ways, because that tells you, whatever you want to call them, the left, the liberal America, the progressives, were so ready to do something, and yet didn't know what. The fact that it's not like the global warming initiative, or it's not the positive name, is like, we're resisting, we want to fight, but we don't have an agenda, we don't have a champion. Who are the champions? Chuck and Nancy, they're great for what they are, but Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, they're both great at their jobs, but they're not charismatic figures. We don't have an Obama right now, who is, the champion of the left. Well, we kind of have Michelle Obama, we don't even have Oprah as kind of retired. So we don't have someone. This side was just waiting to do something and waiting for someone to come forward. And that moment, David Hogg came forward, and one of the powerful, issues that we'd sort of given up on, and we had our agenda, we had our champions, and we went after them. So that was number two, but I think the single biggest is the messenger. Because again, after Sandy Hook, me most of all, I was so depressed and distraught after that, is that the messenger that was primarily Obama and also the parents. And I think I might have gotten into a little bit of a Twitter spat with Shannon yesterday, who didn't, I'm not sure, I think she maybe took a little umbrage about the piece in the New York Times about me over the weekend, where she said essentially that, moms have been doing this all along and are fighting for this. And yes, but the moms, I hope you're okay with, hadn't broken through in the way these kids had. And I think there's a reason for that. I've spent a year analyzing this, and 20 years, most of us, when we see moms or dads of kids who have died, we feel terrible pain, sadness, empathy for you. I had always said, about, the parents of the people, and I know a lot of these people, there's not a more powerful figure in America. It turns out, yes, there is. Because when we see you, we feel all those things. We don't fear. We don't feel fear. At least we don't fear for your life. We don't see you and think, oh, she's going to die if we do something. Every one of you there, or in the audience with the moms, we see you on television, that's powerful, but we are not afraid that you're going to die. When we see Emma Gonzalez, or Cameron, or Jackie, or any of the kids, or even if a kid at school that hasn't been attacked, we don't just see the past targets, we see the future targets. We see that kid talking about this, we see you talking about this, and know you or somebody like you is going to die if we don't do it. And people who look just like you have died and are going to continue to die. You're the face of our disgrace of what we have not done. And I think people like you have a different power than anyone else in this room, because you are the targets. And we've never heard from the targets before. What we didn't realize in Sandy Hook is those 6-year-olds were too young. They could not speak for themselves. And the Parkland kids were the first ones to stand up and speak for themselves, and with a real power. And I don't think anyone in America, I'd never heard anyone write this before until that moment. It was suddenly like, oh, the messenger, it had to be them. And I think that completely changed everything. It was, in addition to all those other things, it's the messenger. And I gave a speech on the second walkout in Austin. They invited me to speak there. And they organized 8 or 10 schools, had a walkout, and they bused them to the state capitol. It was this amazing thing that I was part of. And I told those kids there, I assume most or none of you kids in this audience, there were thousands of them, you have not been shot at. but somebody like you is going to be. And we all know that. You know, there have been shootings in Texas, and sooner or later there's going to be one in Austin, and it may be your school, and every adult who watches knows that. And I said, you know, you have the power too. When you get up and talk at your town hall meeting or your local media or whatever you do, you have your dine or whatever, and you're on local television, and we hear you, every parent is cringing because you're the face of who's going to die if we don't do something. So it's not just the Parkland kids, it's all of you who have that power. And I encourage you to use it.
Reverend, yes.
Oh, thank you.
Reverend, yes.
That's hard to follow. You've touched on this in a number of different ways on a bit of a surface level, and I'm wondering if I could ask you more about the PTSD and the connection through that. I mean,
You
you
mean
talked
of
about
mine?
your own. You mentioned
Oh, or theirs.
Columbine.
Mhm.
You mentioned the kids from Parkland not understanding what the survivors from Columbine went through. They hadn't yet had their first year anniversary, and they just didn't know. So I'm wondering what you can tell us that we don't know, but that we need to know.
Sure. About the people who go through, or the communities, or I mean, I got so many I could actually
I
add.
know about the trauma and the effects of trauma. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
you know,
well,
it makes a motivation.
yeah. Okay. Well, let me tell you one nerdy stat. First of all, so I have a chapter on PTSD, a short chapter, about 2/3 through, and which I first started thinking about last year in about May. So I do study these. I've been studying these school shootings and mass murders ever since, and I'm with a group out of John Jay College, the Academy of Critical Incident Analysis. Now I'm on the board. But we do one usually critical thing every year, and it's sometimes mass murders. Virginia Tech, we went there several years after and met with victims and shrinks and academics from around the country. Anyway, this past year, it was Las Vegas, which was the first time we did one that soon, and I was a little afraid going that soon. But it was very powerful, and it was wonderful. And with, I got to know Chris and Jenny Bobby, spelled like Babbitt, but Bobby, who he was shot in the shoulder, and they were separated, which was kind of horrible. Well, I'll tell you the story. I mean, that was crazy. They were right up against the stage, and people were literally dropping all around them. There were nearly 1,000 people shot. And he was shot, he was down, he's like, I think I'm hit, and they piled, and then they kept running for it. They waited for, they got to be reloading, where there were silences, and they ran and then went down and ran, whole groups of them. And it was pandemonium, and he had her running ahead of him, and she didn't realize there was a lot of problems later about a lot of things they did, they had exits closed off. Anyway, there was a chain that high, and he tripped over it. And so she didn't realize till she was out and with their friends, they turned to see where's Chris, and he wasn't there. Because obviously in the chaos and the noise, they hadn't heard anything. And then so she also had horrible survivor guilt that she didn't go back. Because she's like, oh, I gotta get him. And her friend was like hell you were turning around. He'll make his way out. There's no going back. I mean, you can imagine, piles of bodies. Yeah. And and then they were separated the whole night. But I'm a little off the subject there. Oh, so during that conference, Dr. Frank Ochberg was there, who's become a mentor of mine, and he's a brilliant guy. I'm an Ochberg Fellow at Columbia University, the Dart Center, which is kind of amazing. But also there was another, a younger psychiatrist, Dr. Elise Lay, who was really kind of brilliant and studies especially trauma in adolescents and children. And I kind of sheepishly asked at that point, because I was about to go from there back to Parkland and be with the kids, and was kind of feeling guilty and worried that this activism was just way too much for them and might be really detrimental for them. And I asked her about that, and she said, no, actually on balance, is probably helping them. And later, I asked her for some figures, and I wanted to, like, can you quantify, like, how many people actually get PTSD? Because Dr. Ackberg had given me figures earlier, and she said, I know we've got it for several categories. I don't think we probably have it for mass murder because that's too recent of a phenomenon and not enough, data points. But she said, I'll check. And then the next day she emailed me back. She's like, oh yeah, there is data on the prevalence of PTSD for mass murder, which, by the way, that's, I think, the most disgusting fact in my book. That there has been enough mass murder and enough that, like, someone has studied it and knows how often you get PTSD from mass murder. That should not exist, and that's a recent American humankind. But so, sorry, that was too long way. So people who are victims of assaults, rapes, and mass murder are 2 to 4 times more likely than people with comparable injuries from car accidents, burns, or industrial accidents. 2 to 4 times more likely to get PTSD. And the reason is those other things are really traumatizing too. Like you disfigured in a burn or whatever. That's kind of horrible. The difference is knowing that another human being intentionally hurt you and or tried to kill you or rape you or do something horrible to you really shatters your belief in humanity and your trust, your feeling of safety, is that you can walk outside. Like when you're in a terrible car accident, you may be afraid to get behind the wheel again, but you're not going to be just afraid to, like, walk around in the world. If somebody rapes you, you can be scared to leave the house, or be in the house, or go on a date, or so all these kinds of things. And in mass murders, all those are the same kind of things. Assaults to a lesser degree, but still, some other human being intentionally did that. So that is kind of the core of intentional trauma. And so, Dr. Elise explained, Dr. Lay, Elise is her first name, sorry, used to calling her that, but explained that, so the key to therapy is reestablishing a sense of power and control, of personal power and control. And that's really hard to do. And so in therapy, you do a lot of simulations, role-playing, which can be effective, but anybody who's done that, sometimes it's sort of like, okay, this is kind of BS. Like, okay, I'll do the role play, but okay, come on. And, with different kinds of situations, rapes are probably the most obvious, clear-cut one when you put the guy on trial and convict him. And there can be a sense of reclaiming power there, but usually there's hell to pay for it, right? And then sometimes survivors are different. Some really feel a sense of power from that, and some feel like, well, now he's in jail, that doesn't really help me. But so she was saying, like, in all my years of therapy, with trauma people, like, these kids are actually reclaiming their power. They are on television. They are leading powerful demonstrations. They've got up to 800,000 people on Pennsylvania Avenue. They've got kids everywhere they're going who are like, emulating them, forming these, like, they are actually taking, they are more powerful than that guy who shot at them, which, by the way, don't say his name, but how many people in this room can know the name of the Parkland shooter? Show raise of hands.
I think it's her name.
I see one back there. Is there any over here? One over there. Just a handful. Almost nobody. Oh, you do? Okay, good. Well, you're probably, I also did this at a high school a couple days ago, and I got way more. It's like, okay, of course, you're in high school, like, your studies, you probably did a paper. Like, I forget another way where they're kind of smarter than us. Because every group I've asked, and then in high school, I saw more like, okay, well, you're on the debate team, or you're, like, writing a paper. But hardly anybody even knows his name. And everybody in America knows Emma. Not just everybody in America knows Emma Gonzalez's name. Last week, so the first week of the book tour I had to do American, like last week we were concentrating on, 4 media. I did one day of just Australia and New Zealand. And I was doing Radio New Zealand for about 45 minutes, And when in Wellington, asking like, do you know who these names are? I'm like, she's like, yeah, everybody knows who Emma Gonzalez is. Everybody knows David Hogg.
Wow.
And they know his speech. Everyone, I mean, you might have seen, if you saw John Oliver like a couple weeks ago, like New Zealand isn't even on some maps. But did you all see that? There's like a whole thing, they're being left off of maps, but we don't even know they exist. But they know who these Parkland kids are all over the world. So they have a real power. And that's really, really, I mean, that's, actually is another thing, actually with rapes, I'd forgotten about this. Very early in the book and early in this process, I was really shocked because, so Tallahassee, they did that, I didn't talk much about it, it was a really powerful thing where they got 100 kids to go down 1 week to the state capitol in Tallahassee and talk to the legislators and meet with the governor. And, part of my questions were like, who's paying for all this stuff? And, they got Uber Eats to pay for one of the lunches, and Florida State University donated the 2 giant rooms for all the kids to sleep in. The Red Cross brought in the cots. The buses themselves, I think it was about $12,000, was paid for by Senator Lauren Book, their local state senator. And at first I thought it was like either the campaign or the government, and I was talking to her aide, no, she wanted to do that herself.
Right.
And the reason is because she was a victim of sexual abuse, and now I forgot, it's in the book, from starting at age 12, I think, something like that, till 16 or something. It was an ongoing thing, was like who lived at her house. But that's how she got involved in politics, is because of that, then she pushed for some legislation, failed, tried some more, and eventually became a state legislator. And that's what she said is, she wanted to donate that money, and that's what she saw in Jackie Corn immediately, is like, she saw a younger version of herself. It's like, here's a kid who's been traumatized, and she's going to freaking do something about it. And Senator Book said that was such a powerful thing for her as a rape survivor to retake her power and to do something about it and, change Florida and get some laws changed, and then go on and, change other things. And really wanted to support that. So, I mean, I think these are all good examples of somehow, whatever kind of trauma you've been through, there's different, actually, God, I do know some other things. Like Connie Sanders is, she's the daughter at Columbine of Dave Sanders, the one teacher who died, heroically saving kids. Like he stayed in until he was shot. And she got her PhD in psychology. Actually, also, a lot of people were affected in personal ways. Patrick Ireland, who was the boy in the window who was shot in the head and wasn't expected to ever walk or talk again. He still has a buckshot, 6 inches, traveled 6 inches through his brain. It's still in there. They can never get it out. But then he still he made a miraculous recovery and graduated valedictorian of Columbine the next year. His younger sister, who's also kind of brilliant, watching his physical therapy, she I guess got her PhD. She's a physical therapist now. So lots of people did. But Connie Sanders got her PhD in psychology, and as a therapist, I would have thought, and I think the classic thing is like, to treat other trauma victims. No, she specializes in treating particularly men who are perpetrators of violence. And her thing is like, I am going to fix those bastards, or like help them stop. And she's like, I see her every time I go out there, I talk to her, she sees me when she comes to New York City, and she's like, yeah, they can be a handful, but like, I mean, they're a rough crowd, but they're also, I mean, some of them start as court-ordered, but a lot of them really want to change, and she's good. She's making them change. She's helping them, do better. So I have met so many different people who find a way to take their trauma. I know one more, I won't tell but the best concentration camp jokes I've ever heard are by a man named Asa, I can't remember his last name, who was a concentration camp survivor, not Auschwitz or anything. He's a Serbian concentration camp survivor. He's from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and during the war there, he was in a couple different camps for 10 months. And last I met him at at a thing at Harvard, a session about trauma. And at that point, he was running the Maricopa County Rape Crisis Center, Phoenix. He was a psychiatrist. That's partly why they imprisoned him, because he was sort of the intellectual of the town and standing up to them. But so he's seen trauma in a lot of different ways. So that's also how he deals with it, is like, there's not that much calling for, concentration camp, survivors, but a lot of people getting raped.
It seems
And
like you also did something about it. That's
I
pretty
guess so.
significant.
Yeah. I mean, I try to do my part, and that here's the thing, though. I was really afraid, and I broke the rules. And the first day, I panicked that I'd really done myself in. I thought this was going to maybe get me in trouble. It did the opposite. I mean, here's one thing where karma does really pay off, because they really healed me. I didn't realize, I thought I still had lingering the PTSD, I had triggers and I had to be careful when there was an event, but otherwise I was okay and past it. I wasn't, and I didn't know that until I got to see the pre-Columbine guy again late last year. I'm happy again. And I mean, I've always been a happy guy, but I have not been as happy as pre-Columbine until last year being with the kids. But yeah, I mean, I feel like they're healing America, and they're doing that to all of us who are ready, who aren't just fighting them. And yeah, I feel like they're healing America. They definitely did with me.
In order to allow time for you to sign books, I'm going to have one more question. I'm going to let Edward make it a good one, Edward, so he can have the final question for tonight.
Well, it being the final question, I think it's good to try to end on a positive note, right?
Sure.
With your book, I think largely by the end of it, there's a positive sentiment, right? It feels like the momentum is really in favor of change. But what do you think about it? Are you optimistic yourself, looking forward?
Oh, very much. It was really kind of interesting, partly because I talk about this crap so much, but the guy who interviewed me for New York Magazine, well, he's a freelancer. He interviewed me for some other publication, I guess 2 years ago, he says in his interview. For about 2 years ago. And then last month, when he was interviewing me over the phone, we spent about 3 hours, because I talk a lot. But about an hour into it, he's like, well, he was just like, what? You're like a different person. He said, you were so angry and so depressed when we talked about this. Because, of course, he called, in the wake of one of these, because he's writing a piece on it. I'm sure it was in the few days right after. And he's like, you just completely, you were hopeless, you're demoralized, and really pissed off. And now you're like this. Actually, also, what's her name? Nicole Wallace said, I was on her show either the anniversary or the day before. I really love her 4 p.m. show on MSNBC. And I was on her show several times last year. Well, the day after it happened, I spent the afternoon with her and Brian Williams, and then on her show. And then several times during last year, but not in several months. And when she saw, this time I was just talking about it, and on the air, she's like, you really seem like you're you believe this now. I'm like, yeah. But I do. I mean, it's still going to be tough. I mean, the NRA is not rolling over, but they sure had their asses whipped in November in a way that they haven't in this generation. And they don't know what to do with these kids. They can't do the whole Chuck, from my cold dead hands. They can't. In fact, Dana Lesh is the scary one, because Wayne LaPierre is just comes off as a nutcase, and I don't think he's doing them any favors. But Dana Lesh, she is scary, because she plays the mom card, and she does the whole, and by the way, the same session when Cameron was eviscerating Marco Rubio, Dana Lesh took on Emma Gonzalez and kind of came to a draw. Because Emma, Dana went right to Emma, I'm a mom too. I'm so proud of what you're doing, and I really feel for you. And then gradually made it to in so many words, I understand why you think what you're doing is right. I mean, didn't put it in quite these words, but you're kind of misguided, and this is really going to make things worse for you, and here's why I'm really trying to help you. But I don't know that this woman has an empathetic bone in her body, but she sure has the act down. Like, she sure knows how to pretend that. And she's really good at it, and she's really scary. But still, like, all she knew how to do is kind of like not really let Emma overwhelm her. But other than that, they can't attack these. I mean, sometimes they attack David, but like, they don't know how to fight back against these kids. I mean, that's the other reason, like, they can take on the moms, they can take on a lot of people, but like, and when they do take on the kids, they really have a lot of people who even support them get really the willies about like attacking kids. Like, so they don't know what to do. And I thought it was really pitiful last year. Like, so last year was also the first year that they were spent by opposition groups. I was shocked at how little it was. And I forget the number. Is it 20 million or 22 million they spent? I'm like, 20-ish million? Like, that is nothing in American politics. And the biggest reason is because it was such an intimidation game. Like, if you can like intimidate virtually all the Republicans in the country to like get in line, and a hell of a lot of the Democrats to just keep their mouths shut and not run on them. Like, how many races do you really have to invest in? They can never play with $20 million. You can't obviously play in 435 House districts, much less governors and state races. Like, it's nothing. They didn't have to. They intimidated. They were bullies who intimidated. This time it was wide open, and they were screwed. It was screwed. Like, well, you can't actually play on that field. They're a niche player. So you know, the last chapter is called The Third Rail because Dr. Robert Spitzer, who's great out of Cooney, New York, studying this, said, you know, for the last generation, it's been a third rail of American politics, and no one would go through it because, you know, you touch that gun control thing, and it's probably the end of your political career. And this election showed no more, you know, if anything, the opposite. But it's definitely de-electrified, and you can vote your conscience. And most politicians do want to do most of this stuff. So I'm very, very hopeful. Now, they're regrouping, and they're going to fight back. And but yeah, I'm really hopeful. And like, for the first time, well, I don't know, at least the first time since Columbine, but you know, most of my life, the momentum is back on our side of doing something. So like, let's not lose that momentum, Pete.
On that note, I want to thank our panelists, but mostly Dave Cullen. Thank you so much.